should be good.
Okay. All right. This is a basic guide to advanced incident response. I hope it's what you were in for. I'm Scott. I'm now going to show you a bunch of places that I worked, so you trust me. I worked at Symantec for a while. I worked at this little company called Mandiant. They got bought. I worked for this big, scary, bad movie defense contractor called Mantech for a while. I then went to this tiny little financial startup called Vigilant. They got bought. What you're picking out is my next company is definitely going to get bought by someone. Now I work for this little company called GitHub. Has everybody heard of GitHub? Okay, we're a sticker and t-shirt company that does some Git hosting. You have my card if you need it. I'm fairly easy to get a hold of. I spend my day mostly doing incident response-y kind of stuff. Now, the nice thing is I work for a company that seems to get the whole security thing, so I don't actually respond to a lot of our incidents. I get to spend a lot of time helping other people respond to their incidents. So, somebody broke in, stole a bunch of Git credentials and started downloading code. I'm the guy who gets to help. I also get to spend some time building tools to assist with these things because, especially if you're not in a Windows world, tools are kind of hit or miss in a lot of cases. All right, questions? The point of this is actually not that I think you're curious about anything yet, but I got asked by my wife what this talk was really about, and I was like, well, it's actually what incident responders sit around and talk about over beer. I would love to take each and every one of you out for a beer and get your opinions on all these things, but we don't have time. So it would be better, yell at me, ask questions, interrupt me. I'm totally cool with that. I really enjoy this more as a conversation than anything else. Cool? Okay. One last thing you should know. I always want to be a spy, and that will come up. So when I say a basic guide to advanced incident response, what I really mean is this big, scary, loaded term, intelligence-driven response. At this point, does anybody think it's more than a buzzword? It's pretty tough. When I hear intelligence-driven response, I thought I was going to be this guy, which seemed like it would be fun. I ended up as him, and turned out as just as fun in many cases. But as much as that's kind of an overloaded term, there is some real truth to it. The intelligence community has a number of interesting ways to structure and look at data that, as security people, we can really use. If you go back with the Sun Tzu example, that puts the intelligence community at about 4,000 years? I don't really remember. And our community is at about 30, 40, if you really want to argue, maybe. So there's a lot we can learn. So this is the part where I'm going to tell you a lot of processes that end up being useful. Has anybody gone through the SANS GCIH course? Remember this? Just beaten into you. Ed Scotus just yelled it from the top. So this is the SANS incident response process. So before an incident happens, you get time to prepare. As you work through it, you'll identify an incident. An alert triggers. The FBI calls you up. Brian Krebs calls you up. Then you start to contain it. At this part, you move into eradication, getting rid of the compromise, recovery, getting all of your services back online, and lessons learned. It's great, it's wonderful, it's very streamlined, but honestly, it's not realistic in a lot of cases. You can't really differentiate most incidents out this aggressively, and in many cases, you have to be doing 4 of these steps at the exact same time. So that's the security side of it. When you get to the intelligence side of it, they have this idea, what's called the intelligence cycle. Anybody seen this before? Okay, got you. I'm trying to get you to talk. It's the fun part. So we start off with, in an intelligence aspect, you start off with what are the questions you're interested in asking, your requirements. You collect data that's useful for it. You put that data into a normalized format so that you can study it, work with it, manipulate it. You then try to develop actual answers to the questions posed during your requirements. You share that data with other people, and then you either make use of it and provide feedback on whether or not it was useful. Again, it's a great cycle, and in a purely intellectual world, it has a lot of merit. But in many cases, if you're actually the person running an incident response team or working in a threat intelligence group, you can't sit there and just say, okay, guys, today we're going to be in requirements day. Tomorrow we'll be starting collection, and Friday's tacos, and we're also going to be doing analysis. So we started looking around, and again, we stole something, because that's way easier, and found an ability to marry these two ideas. So this is colloquially called F3EAD, because that's a mouthful. And it's, to us, the way that we combine this intelligence cycle along with this incident response cycle. So at the top, we have the security side of it. Find, which is, let's identify what thing we're looking for. So this is your preparation stage in incident response, and this is your collection, or your requirement stage in intelligence gathering. You find the vulnerability, you figure out who you're looking for, you figure out what it's going to take to identify them, fix, and then finish is the security side, remediate, recovery, all that. Now, at the same time you're doing this, the way we think of incidents is you're also doing the intelligence gathering portion below. And that's this exploit, analyze, disseminate. So what's that mean practically? As an IDS analyst, you come across an interesting event. Okay, that's the beginning of your find. Now, at the same time that that event gets identified as something that might be worthy of an incident, you start trying to develop information on the other side of it, the exploit, analyze, disseminate portion. And the idea is these two cycles work at the same time. Is this making sense? Good example, bad example? First of all, I want to thank you for being the first person to ask a question. Second of all, generally speaking, you'll run this as two different groups. So I've worked in teams where we did this at the same time. It works. It works really well. It just gets a little confusing. It's a lot better to have essentially an intel side and a security side, but the key is they need to be embedded with each other. Where this whole idea came out of was actually a special forces methodology kind of developed during the Gulf War, which was essentially a team of special forces types shows up with a bunch of laptops they stole from some camp. They hand them off to an intelligence team. 6 months later, that team comes back and says, here's all the things that we've got. And by that time, the special forces team's going, we already got them, they all disappeared, something like that. So what they instead started doing was embedding the intelligence teams right next to the special forces teams. I had a friend who got to work on one of these. And so they'd drop off laptops. Literally, the special forces guys would go to sleep. While they were doing that, the forensics guys were analyzing the laptops. And so when the special forces guys woke back up at night, they said, oh, here's 10 pictures of some more people you might want to go visit. And then the cycle continued. So the A-B team does work. The key is both teams have to be really tightly integrated and working together. And that's what we were trying to do, was how to take that security cycle and the intelligence cycle and put them concurrently, not two separate things that fed into different time frames. So the last one of these cycles I'm going to throw at you. What this is all trying to do is improve what we call an OODA loop. And so an OODA loop is essentially a generalized idea of how people make decisions. And so you observe your environment to gather information. You decide what that means to you, so you orient. You make a decision on what to do, and then you do it. And it's a really abstracted idea of what we do all the time. But this works the same way for attackers and defenders as it does for fighter pilots, where this all came from. And so the thing is, if your attacker can do this loop faster than you as a defender, you're always going to be behind. You're never going to be able to beat them to a decision if they're making two decisions in the time you're making one. So this is the academic portion of this. Anybody have any questions? You're all experts on this. Fantastic. Putting that on my resume. For some reason, when I've given this talk previously, this is where everyone wants to talk about active response, which is a great loaded term that everybody likes to talk about. And when you think about it, the way that active defense is recognized is these 5 ideas. Stopping something from happening, deception, degradation, disruption, destroy. And I used to be really anti-active defense. I used to think it was a stupid thing people like to talk about. We're going to hack back everybody. Let's get a bunch of IDS analysts with Metasploit, and hilarity is going to ensue. But the fact is, deny is something everyone does all the time. If you have a firewall, you're denying attackers something. Destroy, yeah, you can't do unless you're law enforcement or military. But the middle ones, deceive, degrade, and disrupt, are really things that advanced teams can eventually get to. But I'm guessing most teams aren't. I'll be honest, my team is not. So if you are, I would really love to talk to you about it. So I've convinced everybody that intelligence-driven incident response is the way of the future and totally how you're going to approach things from now on, right? So you've got to get some intelligence. This has led to a very interesting, I think, aspect of the security community, which is the cyber threat intelligence vendors. Does anybody work for a cyber threat intelligence vendor? If you're on the camera and you're working for one, just don't listen to this next part. Most of them are just going to let you download lists of stuff. There are plenty of places you can download a lot of these indicators from. There are free lists. I say all this having worked for one of these companies, by the way, where we were taking a lot of these lists and trying to turn them into better lists. And I'm not trying to say there's not a lot of value to that, but you have to understand the context around them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to build some context around these indicators. But some common things that you can use to feed into the various network defense systems you have are obviously IP addresses, URLs, domains, a lot of information about malware, hopefully in an automated fashion, because nobody wants to sit there and by hand analyze 10,000 pieces of malware. And then information about certificates, email addresses, and user agent strings. These are typical information that you come across during an incident response that can be developed into further information. Any questions, anybody? No? Feeling good? Okay. So you take all these indicators and you develop this idea of events. I mean, this is kind of the most basic framework that a SOC is going to work under. You have things that happen. Groups of events that have a malicious nature, we tend to classify as incidents. We put them all together, we say, this is incident foo. And what I find is most security operations centers drop everything on the floor at that point and say, incident's over, let's move on, wait for the next one. But where this got really interesting in a particular group I worked in is we said, let's start classifying all of our incidents. So we'd work through our incidents and developed what we called campaigns. And campaigns were groups of like incidents that had just similar characteristics. Eventually when you've seen enough incidents, you start to develop a feel, you start to be able to put them together and understand them as a campaign. Now, we then started to see multiple campaigns that all were similar in their own ways. And this led to us generalizing their TTPs. Free sticker for anybody who knows what TTPs is. Okay, I've got a pile of stickers, so you'll actually can all get them. But good job. Tactics, techniques, and procedures. And so at this point, we got to a really interesting place. We started to understand a lot of these attackers that we were seeing on a day-in, day-out basis. We developed names for them, some nice, some not so nice. And we'd started to get a feel for their personalities. And this seemed like an interesting academic exercise until we got to the point where we would see a new attack come in, have an idea ahead of time when we saw the attack based on their techniques, where they were going to go next, and could try to sit there and be in front of them before they got there. So that's a powerful place. That was us getting inside their OTA loop. And that's really what I think everybody needs to be aiming towards, and what a lot of tools are trying to help us get to. The question we then had was, how do we keep track of all this information? And weirdly enough, it was just a basic wiki. I don't know if anybody's using wikis for network defense kind of stuff, but it's an incredibly useful way to kind of group this information. Because while we had a very somewhat structured taxonomy of how we were tracking things, it needed to be dynamic enough that we could put it into different formats or be able to change everything for a particular incident. But we also needed to be something that everybody could work on together. So if you're tracking incidents in like text files or things like that, this might be a good direction to go. So we already said, those are the interesting things to get try to gather intelligence around, but where do you actually get the data? You can go to a vendor, and there are vendors that have some useful information. There's also a ton of information for free online. This internet thing, it's going to be big. There are plenty of people who are generating malicious IP lists and sharing them. Many of them are similar lists to the ones that the threat intelligence vendors will then come back and sell you for a lot more money. You can use all kinds of online services. I like IP Void, URL Void, and MyWatt. People have done some amazing work with mining VirusTotal. If you want something interesting to read, Brandon Dixon, VirusTotal. He did some crazy stuff with tracking actors as they were uploading their malware to test if it was being detected on VirusTotal. If you haven't played with Shodan, it's a really great tool. Central Ops, RobTex, those kind of things. I may have seemed like I've kind of said some bad stuff about vendors so far, but I want to be upfront. They provide some great information as well. I think everybody kind of, the new standard got set when Mandiant released their APT1 report for not just including text, but also including a ton of indicators. We mine vendor information from a bunch of vendor blogs, podcasts. Whenever they release reports, we read through those, gather information. These are really rich sources of intelligence. The only thing I'll warn you, to go back to my anti-vendor stance, they are trying to sell you something. So take it with a grain of salt, use a bad email address, things like that. This is such a dumb thing, but it's again, when Google's Aurora incident came out, and they came out and said, we got hacked. And then 40 other companies all came out and said, we got hacked too. Those all didn't happen at the exact same time. So there has to be some ability for organizations to share information and to be able to get ahead of incidents before they strike multiple companies at different times. So I work all day. This is like the most redacted slide I've ever put up. It's kind of useless actually, but GitHub is a company that basically lives in chat. We have about 75%, 70% remote workers. So this is the GitHub office to us. I also spend all day in a personal chat with a bunch of other security people. And the point of this is just this idea of we're constantly sharing information back and forth. And it can be dumb things like links, or it can be dumb things like lists of IP addresses and samples of malware. So trust groups are an interesting one. I love and hate them. If you're involved in the trust group thing, it's kind of like Fight Club. You don't talk about it. I'm talking about it, so maybe they're going to throw me out. But there are groups of like-minded people who basically try to share information about threats. There are some that are really easy to get into, and you can get information about a particular segment of threat. There are some that are very industry dependent, so the FSISAC for the financial industry. And then there are some like this that were a group of companies that all got hit by the same denial of service attacks. So we all just kind of banded together and formed a group to start sharing information about these denial of service attacks. And this was best summed up by a guy who's, I know him as M. Goffin, Mike. who had this tweet that gathering intel from others gives you a view of their world, and then feeds into how you gather information about your own world. So developing your own intel, we've talked about all these sources you can get it from, but what about your own intel? What I said was, we took this idea of, let's start gathering information about events and making them incidents, but then let's not stop and let's keep moving up the chain. I can't recommend that enough. If you have a mature security program and you're not going back and digging through the last 50 incidents you've had to see what about them was the same, you're really missing out on probably a richer source of data than any IDS you have. So any questions on developing some intelligence? I know it's the middle of the afternoon. You guys didn't get a coffee break. I would have brought in Red Bull and puppies to get everybody excited. Any questions? Love the conversation? All right. Which is good, because I'm going to get into something a little controversial. So, who got asked over the holidays about Sony? Who got asked if they thought it was the North Koreans? It's an interesting question, and if you saw the article from Der Spiegel yesterday, there might be some new and interesting information. Here's my take. Unless you have bombers, an ability to actually get court orders that get followed, because, we did indict all the guys from APT1, and I don't think they've shown up in court yet. Or you're Thor from Swordfish 2. Attribution really doesn't do as much good as people say. Reading reports that actually talk about who individual people are or give you unit names or something like that are interesting, but how much do they really change anybody's ability to react to security incidents? I can say working in the defense sector, it didn't change mine very much. And if it didn't change for a defense contractor, I can't imagine how it would for a lot of other people. So there are useful aspects of attribution. What I talked about where we worked up that chain was we started to develop an idea of attributing TTPs, common technical sophistication, common goals, things like that. We had group names. We could attribute to a code name a lot of these types of information. What we really didn't care that much about was things like geography, who people work for, actual names. It's kind of cool to be able to track someone down and show someone a picture, and then they say, can we do anything about it? And you go, no, they're in the middle of nowhere, Russia. Kind of doesn't help. So this is all a great idea. You understand the techniques behind it, but how do you begin? So to begin with, it's hard. I've worked in 2 organizations that have gotten to the point where I feel like we've implemented about 80–85% of this. And it's a lot of work. It takes buy-in from a lot of different groups, and it requires a tremendous amount of perseverance, because I'll tell you, it doesn't work at first. When you first start these type of techniques, you don't have enough information to go off of. You're writing things down that you think you're never going to come back to again. And it's only after about 6 to 9 months when you start seeing a really massive improvement in your security stance. So to do that, you've really got to start by getting good management buy-in. You need someone who's going to have the patience to give you the time and the resources to make this happen. But when you're going to management, don't FUD people. It's really easy with all these massive reports coming out and things like that to say, country X is coming for us. Be realistic about that and develop it based on real information, not just who the last group that got tweeted about was. I've never mentioned this one before, but I think it's really important. If you're going to build a team like this, don't use the same network you're trying to defend. If the bad guys have gotten all of your AD credentials and then can log directly into SOC Workstation 1, you haven't done as much to protect yourself as you think. A capability like this requires you to develop a mature network forensics capability. This one's tough because it tends to be a lot of expensive hardware to go along with getting your network team to actually let you install any of it. Which, has anybody had to have that argument? Horror stories, huh? No, it's no fun. I promise this flow monitoring system isn't going to take down our entire network. Even when you're 90% sure you're correct on that, it's still tough. You'll need the ability to do system forensics. We do less of this than I think we ever have before. But when you have a compromised system, there are certain things that are really important. I actually probably should have added something. Has anybody read what is it? Digital Forensics and Incident Response, the new 3rd edition that just came out from the Mandiant team. If you're doing DFIR, it's a great book. And they talk a lot about what they refer to as like live analysis. Essentially, sets of scripts that go on and just grab pertinent volatile information, not necessarily RAM, but also not, copying an entire hard drive. Great. Those two are fairly easy to get going. One of the tougher ones is actually developing information outside your own perimeter. And this is kind of a weird one because it's actually something marketing teams are way better at than most security teams. So, understanding things like sentiment analysis, monitoring social networks, all of these things are not just for the NSA anymore. You can do them at home. But they take a lot of effort and a lot of custom programming and things like that. People also ask about honeypots a lot. Is anybody running any honeypots? Do you get anything useful out of them? We are on camera, that's true. I have run a couple honeypots before. I have gotten some interesting things out of them, but I feel like now that we've gotten past the age of mass malware that just scans the internet looking for everything vulnerable, the APT groups aren't trying to port scan your entire network before they come in. So that's the technology aspect. From a personnel aspect, having a plan is really important. Does everyone have an incident response plan? You didn't realize I was going to be asking you so many questions during this whole thing, did you? Having an incident response plan is key, but testing it is also key. Having an incident response plan that you've never used before and then have an incident is brutal. And what you're going to find out is you were almost 60% wrong. A quote from my dad, but it's a great one in this case, is he was talking about baseball. But when it's time to perform, the time to prepare has passed. The importance of having a working IR plan that doesn't just exist, but you've also worked through, seen the kinks, revised, worked through again, makes running a real incident 100 times better than it would be just trying to make it up as you go along. And as soon as you get to that point, you also have to know when to completely throw your plan out the window and improvise. It's a tough thing, but I've seen incident response teams that are so rigidly following their own procedures, they're missing obvious paths of action. So Chris was a guy who works over at, I think, Ernst & Young in the UK, and he had a great point that agility is what's really key for incident response. So if it isn't measurable, it didn't happen. If you don't have logs, you're lying, you're making it up. If you've ever had a user come to you and say, I totally saw my computer do this thing, it was really weird, that user's usually not correct. So if it's not measurable, it didn't happen. If you're doing your incident response and you didn't write it down, you probably don't remember it correctly. It's really easy to kind of make up details for incidents after the fact. It's kind of like fish stories, like, oh, I swear it was the APT-27. They were 16 inches long. I don't know. I'm mixing fish stories and APT stories. But the details matter. And so good notes, good metrics are really key. It's important to trust your own instincts. It's important to not overthink everything. It becomes really easy in an incident to assume the worst, to jump to conclusions, and to not follow the details as they're in front of you. We've talked a lot about collaboration. I work at GitHub. Collaboration is kind of what we do, so it's kind of a theme. But at GitHub, one of the things that's been really key to us is we collaborate really tightly between our defensive team and our application security team. So every incident ends up with a vulnerability assessment, and every vulnerability assessment generally is an incident response. Because when we identify a new vulnerability, the first key has to be when was this vulnerability used that we don't know about? And when we have an incident that leads to a new vulnerability, they need to go triage, the AppSec guys need to go triage that immediately as well. If you're also not making friends with your legal, public relations, and human relations teams, you'll pay for that. If you followed the Target thing at all, their security team and their public relations team were clearly not on the same page. So yeah, I actually ended up doing a bunch of writing about this, but Target's PR nightmare was made so much worse by the fact their security team and PR team were on two totally different pages. So if you're a security team lead and you don't know who your PR people are, I really recommend making those connections. And the last one, since I like spies and stuff that goes along with them, is a quote that comes out of kind of the special forces area. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and the corollary is fast is lethal. It's when you're working through these steps, and when you get it down to a set of procedures, it becomes really easy to just want to run through your checklists as quickly as you can, run through your plan as quickly as you can. Slowing down can make all the difference in the world. Saving 5 minutes can save you 5 hours later. I worked with an incident responder who, I swear he sounded like a jazz radio DJ. Like, he'd come in and be like, so, I understand you're having an incident. We should talk about that. Can you give me some details? Meanwhile, I was 24 years old, and I'm running around going, everything's hacked, everything's owned, we're gonna die! And one was productive, and the other one was my response. Any questions at this point? Okay. So this tends to be the part everybody likes of this talk. So some great IR tools that will actually be useful for implementing all of these things. Google released a really cool tool called GER a few years ago at this point. They just actually put it onto GitHub, so it's now open source, as opposed to whatever being on Google Code was. And essentially, it's a defensive rootkit. That's kind of the way I think of it. It lives on your host systems. It gathers information for you, lets you do remote forensics, lets you do remote memory analysis, lets you say, tell me any system in my network that's currently connected to this IP address. And lets you do those kind of things on a system-by-system basis by phoning home to a remote server. It's very cool. It's cross-platform, which is great. It runs, I'm running it on OS X and Linux. It also runs on Windows. It's got a nice web interface. It's a really cool tool for doing the kind of remote forensics that are important when you're running an international organization, like this guy. Moloch, if you've used NetWitness but don't like the NetWitness price tag, Moloch is what you're looking for. The AOL team built this, and it's essentially full content monitoring and data mining for all network traffic, including pretty graphs and maps and things like that. As far as network tools that are not signature-based go, although it will do some signature stuff, it's the best thing out there. If you are looking for signatures, everybody does love Snort. It's still one thread, right? Or one process, right? Yeah. Securicata was basically built around all the parts of Snort that everybody loves, namely the signatures, and then they built a faster, more modern implementation. Snort's great, especially if you're buying all the SourceFire tools, but for open source stuff, I really like Suricata right now. Kind of along the lines of GR, but a little bit lighter weight. Mozilla released a tool called MIG that these again both sit on a host and let you query it for information. OS Query was released by Facebook, and this one's interesting because it actually exposes an entire host remotely as a series of SQL tables, which initially was kind of strange, and then they started explaining the sort of things you can do. So, select star from OS X kernel extensions where kernel extension not signed. Like, that's actually a really cool capability. Full disclosure, I've committed to this project. I think it's awesome. The Yelp guys released a tool for doing OS X live forensics, or I'm sorry, live response. So it'll sit there and pull information about all your kernel extensions, browser plugins, browser history, what's in your downloads folder, things like that 95% of the time are all you need to conduct an incident response. And especially being that it's on Mac, where the tooling is mostly terrible, this has been one of my go-to tools. When you have all that malware information, one of the best things you can do with it, create Yara signatures. Yara is kind of like an antivirus engine if it just came with detection and didn't do the terrible response stuff, and lets you develop your own signatures in a really easy to kind of build format. Autopsy and SleuthKit are open source forensics, like disk forensics tools for when you actually need to break down and tear through a hard drive. I'm going to embarrass my friend Kyle Maxwell because he actually did 2 projects that were great, and this picture of him is kind of funny to me. Maltrieve is kind of the answer I think a lot of people are looking for when they start doing threat intelligence stuff. It's set up to basically go grab a ton of different malware feeds, put them all into a nice, easy-to-use format to do things like feed into a sandbox or something like that. And then Combine does the same thing for IP lists, URL lists, the typical kind of threat intelligence vendor information. Memory analysis has become a fairly big deal. Volatility's been around for a long time. Google then forked it and made Recall. Both are great tools for doing memory analysis. This one's kind of a one-off, and it's awesome. It's called Scumbler, and it has a follow-up tool called Scummy? Another name along those lines. And it's for mining things like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all these different places where people post lots of social information, and being able to pull links, look for specific words, things like that. So there's not really anything else out there like this.
Isn't that based on proprietary information on Netflix's environment? I just heard a talk about the guy that from Netflix, I think had Screwdriver. He mentioned that they have a 40 release stuff. That was the follow-up.
I think there are plugins for Scumbler that they haven't released yet. Scumbler, as it stands right now, is really focused, but really good at what it does. So, if you want to look for a keyword on, a particular technology of yours or something like that, Scumbler is awesome for saying, here's all the people on Twitter who've mentioned X thing. And then the add-on piece for it will then go and actually grab links in a safe way for you. So, for instance, you don't want to go to malware site X. It'll go there for you, pull all the information in a way that won't pop your brand new MacBook. I use VirtualBox and Vagrant a lot for basically doing temporary environments. These are kind of DevOps-y tools, but if you're not playing with them, I really recommend it. Got that huge pile of malware sitting around. Cuckoo Sandbox, it's been around for a while. It's an awesome tool. It's easy to get set up, and I think for me does 95% of the malware analysis I ever really want. For kind of tying all this together, you've got some SIMs. OSIM by Alien Vault's great. I've been playing around with Elasticsearch a lot. It's essentially kind of a Splunk sort of tool with a lot of flexibility going along with it, being that it's all open. A cool one, though, that's also coming out is Mozilla is building a SIM based on the Elasticsearch backend called MozDef. And everybody's getting the joke now. Okay. And MozDef is coming along, and it looks like it's going to be really cool for kind of a new intelligence-driven SIM platform, as opposed to kind of the others, which are basically trying to be open source ArcSight. So you've got more. It's great. So you've got more money than you know what to do with. Scott, I don't like open source. I'd rather pay people for stuff. Here's a lot of basic tools that go along with the open source ones. But a lot of times there's not even a tool for what you need to do. In cases like that, there's a lot of great command line tools that can be tied together in some really interesting ways. This is me using a combination of tools, in particular JQ, which is for basically parsing through JSON files. And so this is me taking one of our esoteric weird log formats at GitHub and making it so I can import it directly into Maltego. Super easy one-liner, figured it out once, just keep it on my desktop, use it all the time. Beyond that, if you're, like I said, I work on a lot of open source tools, some that I share, some that I actually aren't open source, I keep to myself. But being able to develop some of your own tools is really, really important in our current day and age. This was put really well by Postmodern, that we might actually figure out how to start automating stuff. Going along with that is this idea of DevOps, taking a lot of the things that we do on a fairly common basis, like standing up machines for going to look for malware, building out services, things like that. Being able to automate a lot of those things is awesome. So, in conclusion, I think intelligence-driven response gets you to the answers you want faster, lets you do a better job protecting your network, and can really up your game as an incident response team. There's a ton of cool open source tools that will make a lot of that easier, and collaboration is actually the next step beyond all of that. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you couldn't hear, I was talking about CRITS, which is a tool MITRE released for doing, it's collaborative research into threats, I believe is the name. It's very cool, a very cool way for tracking a lot of this common intelligence data. And a lot of these questions can essentially be fed into that, and it can kind of help you collaborate that inside your own team, as well as making it easier to share some of that stuff outside your team. So no, it's a very cool tool, and I kept thinking about trying to add a slide to it today, but I didn't have a screenshot, so I didn't know what to do. So.
You mentioned categorizing and reviewing your incidents or campaigns. Is there any particular framework, or did you develop something from it?
So we were using, so I've actually already open sourced some blog, or some wiki templates that I was using for doing that. They were in DokuWiki at one point. I think I updated them to Markdown, which is what we use a lot at GitHub is Markdown documents. And so that's the framework that's under. I've updated it a little bit with some of the F3 EAD stuff, and I don't know if I've actually pushed those up, but that's all on my GitHub which is github.com/sroberts. So you can find that in there. And that's, oh, I'm actually walking away from this. That's actually really all we did at one point, and was really effective. Now, I've iterated on that a little bit from there. I'm working on something it's not quite ready for public consumption yet, but if you want to talk more about that afterwards, be happy to. So.
You put a lot of this stuff that you gather in that sticks format or open IRC?
So that's a fun question. How do you store all this data? I'm not crazy about sticks or OpenIOC, which are kind of the two big generalized ones. The reason is complicated, but can mostly be summarized as XML is awful, and nobody really wants to work with it. And so I keep a lot in Yara, keep a lot in Snort, keep a lot kind of almost basically just Python data structures that I can plug in somewhere else later when I need them. Playing around with doing a lot in JSON because it actually gets you a structured data format that human beings can look at and read. But that's honestly a tough problem. Crits is great, and I think it's a cool tool, but the fact that it wants to do everything in the MITRE sticks taxi something, I don't even know.
For instance, like the FSI stack is standardized with the sticks platform, and they have a nice GUI and everything built in, and you can see the data in readable format.
Yeah, and I mean, you can, Mandiant has done a great job with using OpenIOC, another XML-based format, and putting it into ways that people can use. I just know I get sent enough stuff that I need to look at and triage before I can load it up into a new interface that would be frustrating for me. So that's an interesting and difficult problem. And the question really is, who'd be the ones to decide what the right format is for the security community? We don't really have a W3C for security. So, anybody else? Cool. I'll be around. Thanks, everyone.